Welcome all to today's meeting of the Adults Communities Overview and Scrutiny Committee. I would like to remind everyone present this meeting will be broadcast live via the County Council's website and will also be available for viewing after the meeting. Can everyone please switch their microphone on when speaking and turn it off when finishing speaking? I've received apologies from Dr. Bremner with Mrs. Maggie Wright acting as his substitute and from Mrs. Brawley with Mr. Kaufman acting as her substitute. As you will be aware, it is the intention today that we discuss agenda items 8 to 11 this morning. We will then have a break for lunch and reconvene at 2 o'clock to consider agenda item 12, the development of a unitary structure for local government in Leicestershire. So agenda item 1 is minutes of the meeting held on the 11th of September. I propose the minutes of the meeting held be taken as read, confirmed and signed. Is everybody in agreement? Agreed. Thank you. Agenda item 2, question time. There have been no questions received. Agenda item 3, questions asked by members under Standing Order 7.3 and 7.5. No questions being received from members. Agenda item 4, I have not been notified of any urgent items. Agenda item 5, declarations of interest. I'm assuming that all members who are district borough councillors will wish to declare a personal interest in item 12, the development of a unitary structure for local government in Leicestershire. Does anyone else have any other declarations of interest to make? Right, silence implies assent, that's always good. Declarations to party whip. We have no declarations that I'm aware of. And we have no petitions presented under Standing Order 36 under agenda item 7. So we will then go straight into the first agenda item today, which is the review of long-term residential and nursing care fees. I take it everybody has got a copy of the additional papers? The question on, brilliant. Right, so if I could pass over to you, please, Sandy.
Thank you, Chair. Despite the fact that the majority of care home placements in Leicestershire are self-funders, the Council is still a very significant commissioner of residential care and residential nursing care. And the fees that we pay for care homes are the largest single element of the adult social care budget. And even though our aim is to reduce the number of people we place in care homes are still going to be a major part of the landscape going forward, and we're still going to continue to spend a lot of money on them. And any changes that we make to care home fees is going to have a significant impact on the Council's finances, but actually just as importantly on the quality of care received by vulnerable people in Leicestershire and on the viability of the care market in Leicestershire. The Council's got a duty to set the usual costs that it pays for residential care, and we last fundamentally reviewed those costs in 2011, and they've been subject to annual reviews since then, so they haven't stayed frozen, but we haven't reviewed the fundamental basis of the fees that we've paid since then. And there's now a need to complete a more systematic review and ensure that we do a detailed analysis to ensure that the price we pay for care is fair, both to the Council and the providers and to residents, and is also sustainable in that we carry on with a care market in Leicestershire which is able to provide care in the volumes and quantities that we need. There's already been quite significant engagement with providers to understand the effectiveness of the current arrangement and the fee options that we would have to make any changes to these. Cabinet has approved that we enter into a two-stage consultation on draft proposed changes, And the key elements of those changes are outlined in paragraph 13 of the report. The first consultation stage will cover, I suppose, the kind of architecture of how we work out fees and how we pay them and how we specify them and the contractual arrangements, those kind of areas, and the processes that we put in place for agreeing placements and agreeing prices. And the second stage is actually about setting the proposed fee rates and the arrangements for people to transition from the existing arrangements we have for fees into what the new alternative arrangements might be. The consultation on the first stage is due to commence next week, and the committee's now got the opportunity to comment on the proposals, the draft proposals, and the proposed focus for the consultation. And a further report will be taken to Cabinet in June 2019 regarding the outcome of the consultation, and we'll make recommendations on the proposed way forward, and any changes we make to the fee rates would then be backdated to April 2019. I've got with me Fiona McMahon, who's been doing some of the detailed, sorry, I'm going on the next report now. She hasn't done the work on this at all. She's here for the next report. Apologies for that. I'm happy to take any points from the committee, and I'll ensure that those are reflected in the consultation. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandy. Mrs. Newton?
Sandy, just two questions, if I may. The first one's a short one. I just wanted to more or less know how many out-of-county placements they are and whether they do cost us more in the long term. But the main question really is, half of those in residential care are actually self-funders, and I just wonder what will be the resource implications of increased fees for those who are self-funding. Will that mean they'll be more eligible for council funding or less? How will that work pan out in actual terms, in terms of what we will save as a council?
Thank you for that. The first issue on the numbers of placements out of county, I don't have the number in front of me, but I think it's around 300, maybe just over 300, who are placed out of county. Now, the majority of those are actually in the city. So when they say out of county, they're not a long way away. And for many people, actually, a home in the city might actually be closer than most of the alternatives in the county. So I think over half of those are in the city. The rest are either in just over the border. So if you live in the border with Nottinghamshire or Northamptonshire, you may well be placed in a home just over the border. But then there are a number of people who are kind of spread throughout the country. And those are a mixture of people who've been placed in order to be near to family members, or other people who are mostly younger adults who have been placed as children in residential schools and are then built up links in that location and then may remain in that locality but still remain the responsibility of the council. And those are really could be anywhere in the country. In terms of your second question about self-funders, yeah, well, there isn't a direct implication for self-funders in that the fees that the council sets aren't necessarily currently the fees that self-funders pay, and that it's an open competitive market or not so competitive market, and the providers can charge different levels of fees from the council's rate or from between self-funders. They're not required to have a single set rate, and we can't set that rate for them. The real implication, I think, is probably for people who whose relatives pay a third-party top-up. So there are a number of people where the council will say that's the usual cost we'll pay, and we can place that person at that cost in a home. If that's not the home that the individual or the family want, they have the option then of paying a top-up fee, which could be quite significant, which they then pay that contribution. So clearly, if the council were to increase its fee rates, there might be an implication for self-funders, and that and for people paying top-ups, because they would then potentially pay less. But it's a complicated arrangement, and there isn't a single self-funder rate. If each provider charges their own rate, and may not be the same rate for everybody.
Mrs. Wright.
I think you've probably covered it. My question really was around third-party top-ups. One question is really, are we guaranteeing that nobody will be any worse off under the changes? And also talking about out of county, not particularly the city, because I think the city tend to go lower, but if we go to other counties, they are normally probably higher than we pay. What's the adverse effect will it be to people out there?
I suppose the question in terms of will anybody be worse off, I suppose it depends who you mean and what you mean by worse off. There's no direct implication on the service user charge in terms of what we pay. So people are assessed to pay a charge. This is residents are assessed to pay a charge which is based on a means test, and people will pay the maximum charge which they're deemed able to afford, and they pay that charge kind of almost irrespective of what we pay. So if someone's maximum assessed contribution is £150 a week, if we increase our fee, their maximum contribution is still £150 a week. So in terms of the charging policy, there is no implication in terms of the fees that we pay. I suppose the issue is that if the question is will people be worse off, do we mean that the providers would have a guaranteed level of fee, which is at minimum what they get now? I think that isn't kind of guaranteed, because when we review the rates, we will determine what we think is a fair price for care based on what the actual costs are. And if we think we're paying currently more than the actual costs are, we would need to enter into a negotiation about how we would get to the fee which we think was the correct fair fee for that person, and that will form part of the transitional arrangements.
I think what I was trying to get at was if you're already paying a third-party top-up,
Right,
and then we increase it even more because of the changes, third party is difficult to maintain for anybody, and if we're increasing it even further. So it was the transitional part I was trying to establish there.
it's just right. In relation to the third-party top-ups, I think that's a complicated question, because the third-party top-up isn't just determined by the council; it's also determined by the provider. One of the things that we will want to do is ensure that third-party contributors are protected, and the way that currently it works in Leicestershire, and it's similar in many other parts of the country, is that the council pays the whole of the fee gross to the provider and then collects the third-party contribution from the third party. And there are a number of reasons to do that, and one of those is really to protect the third party from being asked to make ever larger third-party contributions by the provider, to put some controls in place to protect the third party, and we will definitely be wanting to keep those kinds of protections in place for third parties. But at the end of the day, the provider can ask for increases in fees, which are over and above what the council would pay. that's always going to be an issue, and it's going to remain an issue going forward in terms of the provider may want higher increases in fees than the council's prepared to pay from by itself.
Mr. Crooks.
Thank you, Chairman. I was going to ask about means testing, but that's already been covered. The other question I was interested in is how do we decide on third-party top-ups? What's the regulations? What's the governance? I'm new to this committee, so I have not come across this before.
Right, I'll do my best to answer that. The third-party top-up is there really to enable choice. So the position is that if you are eligible to move into a care home and you're eligible to receive funding from the local authority for that care in a care home, you could have a choice about which care home you move into. And as long as the council contracts with that provider, you've got a choice to move into that home. But the council sets its usual cost for care, and if the home is that you want is prepared to accept a placement at that usual cost, there is no requirement for there to be a third party top-up. If you want to choose a home that asks for more than the council is prepared to pay for its usual cost, you can be asked to pay a third party top-up, which is essentially the difference between what the council's prepared to pay and what the provider is saying that they would charge, and then that's the fee where the council then collects that amount from a third party, who's usually a relative. Individual residents are not allowed to pay their own top-up because they would make a contribution, a means-tested contribution for their own resources. That's why it's a third party top-up. It has to come from a third party.
So what happens if there's no third party that's willing to make these top-ups?
Well, the obligation on the council would be to ensure that they got appropriate care, and the council would need to identify a placement that would to take them at its required rate. If the council is unable to do that, then the council would have to find another home that would take them at a higher cost. But usually it would be to make the placement at the council's usual cost of care.
Mrs. Fryer.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I just have a couple of questions, if I may, please. On page 14, under paragraph 9, or point 9, it gives us some figures on how many people are currently living in residential and nursing care. 2,100. Some are older and some are working age. I wondered if it's possible, or you can let us have the information, as to how they're split into the current categories, because it's a 2,100. And also, while we're on that paragraph, it says the projected care is 86 million, but I think later on it says that the net estimated cost is 53 million, where it's under the resource implications. So that was my first question. So while you're looking that up, my second question is, under the proposals, paragraph 13, it's the proposed changes are that the 5-band system for older adults will be replaced by a 2-band system. What will the categories of those 2 bands be? Because obviously I presume that the 5 that are indicated under paragraph 10 suddenly become 2, and I just wondered on the split. Thank you very much.
Okay, I'll endeavour to try and remember all the questions. If I miss any, then do remind me, please. In terms of the split between younger and older adults, I think it's in the report. I think there's it's about 1,700 are older people and 400 younger people.
Sorry, I was meaning what categories they come into out of the 1,700. Are they
Oh, so
mental illness dependent, learning?
Okay. Right. I think the 1,700 older people are actually in the three because of those 5 bands. Three of the bands are for older people. Bands there's a bands 1, 3, and 5, and those are really based on the level of care that people need. Currently, there are very few people in band 1. I think it's a handful, and the split between band 3 and band 5, which essentially is a one for kind of frail older people and one for kind of very frail older people. And I think it's about a 60-40 split between those. And the younger adults are really a mixture of people young, and if you talk about younger adults, we mean under 65. A split between the biggest group are people with learning disabilities, and then the rest are people with mental health difficulties or physical disabilities. Your second question was. That's right. So in some ways, it's actually 3 bands reducing to 2, because these are the bands for older people. So currently there are 3 bands for older people, and the 2 bands one will be a kind of standard residential care band, and will be an enhanced one. So it really be a split between people who need really based around the levels of care that people require. One will be a higher level of care and a higher level of kind of individual care and more 2-to-1 care that would be required.
And it was just to clarify that
The next.
where it says the net cost is 53 million.
Yeah. The difference really there between the two is around the service user charges. What one is the gross cost. So what the council actually pays. Actually, what's netted off that is that we also get income from the NHS for some patients as well. That's the gross cost is 86, and then the net is really just taking off the income that we receive from charges to service users based on the means test.
Before I pass on to the next question, can I just clarify something? I was just a bit puzzled there when you answered one of Hillary's questions. If we're saying that 3 bands are effectively becoming 2, and there's nobody in band 1 or very few, are we looking to have band 3 as the minimum, or are you saying that charge could be a combination of a figure between 1 and 3?
I think it's not kind of straightforward as that. I think because we are really changing the definitions completely. So we're not just substituting the bands 3 and 5 and just calling them something different. We're actually changing how they're defined. I think broadly the people who would be captured in the old band 1, by and large, we say shouldn't be in residential care at all. They should be supported in more independent alternatives. What I think we're trying to do is then, with the 2 new bands, more accurately define what is now a much more complex group of people than previously were in residential care. I think what I'd characterise it as saying is that residential care is now really for people who are very frail, who it's very difficult for those people to get the kind of quality of life and the support they need at home, and that's who residential care should be for. So it's really for people who are got very complex needs, who are very frail, and the length of time that people spend in residential care is declining, because that's because people are being admitted kind of later in their life journey, as it were, and whereas people might previously have been in a care home for a number of years, the amount of time people spend in care homes is reducing as people are admitted later when they're much more frail. So the new bandings are trying to reflect that. So I suppose band 3 is describing care for people who are currently, could include people who are more frail than people who are in the current band 3, and the new enhanced band will be for people who really do require very high levels of care.
Mr. Colfin.
Thank you, Chair. I'm a substitute here, so if I ask the question which shouldn't be asked, I'm sure you'll tell me, Chair. I'm finding this very confusing, not the report, but the whole idea of funding. Did I understand correctly that you could have 2 people in the same residential home? One is a self-funder and one is paid for by us, and the home would be receiving 2 different rates. So taken from that, would the self-funder be subsidising the person that's paid for by the county council? Can I come back again when I've heard the answer?
Yeah, you're absolutely correct. People can the provider can be receiving quite different levels of income because it's the provider can charge to self-funders a fee that they think they can charge. Now, having said that, there are providers who don't charge differently. There are providers who will not charge more, and the difference in fee rates between providers can be very marked. The cost of residential care in different homes, can be very significantly different. The question about are self-funders cross-subsidising publicly funded placements has been debated all over the place, and certainly if you asked providers whether that was the case, if a provider was sitting next to me, they would absolutely say that is the case. I think what I'd say from the council's point of view is that we really kind of 2 things really. One is that we base our fee on what we consider to be a fair price based on a detailed assessment about what the actual costs of providing care are. So it's not just some arbitrary sum that we set. It's actually based on what we actually think it costs. And some providers are able to provide care more efficiently than others. And I think the kind of second element is that the council is also a bulk purchaser of care. So I think it from that point of view is in a position to negotiate different rates from that point of view, and that's I suppose the way that you'd expect a market to function.
Well, thank you for that. Well, that really leads me to my next question, because I find this, I assume the council paid for person will get a cup of tea without a saucer, but if you're a private funder paying the luxury rates, you'll get a saucer with your cup of tea, and I'm sure that isn't happening. But I just wondered, do we have some form of duty of care to self-funders to make sure that market forces don't rip them off? And alternatively, is there a legal way that the council can purchase places for self-funders? So making use of the council's ability to purchase in bulk so that the self-funders get the benefit of your bulk purchases, or is that, and if so, do we do that?
In short, the answer is yes and yes. So absolutely the council, if an individual who's a self-funder wants to approach the council and ask the council to undertake an assessment of their need and then on their behalf commission services for them, then the council is prepared to and does undertake that role, and we make a charge for doing so. So it's a nominal charge, it's an annual fee. There are a number of people who take that up each year, a couple of hundred people each year who approach the council, and we commission care on their behalf. That's perfectly reasonable. All councils do that.
Perhaps if I may, Mr. Kaufman, just before that, we did discuss this at the group about the commissioning services on behalf of others. So if you go back through the previous papers, you will see a debate as to the cost this council charged for providing that service as well, which might be worthwhile. I'll just indicate it might be worth you looking at that as well at a later date.
For that, but I just wondered, are you able to tell us what you are saving the residents who make use of your services? Because certainly the people I've spoken to, and I don't pretend to be an expert and have spoken to thousands of people, but I haven't come across that before. And what are you able to save a resident?
We don't keep information of that nature. We don't kind of routinely monitor what a person would have been paying if they're a self-funder against what they might be paying if they're being commissioned through the council. We're simply commissioning a service on behalf of an individual who's approached us. Other than that, we don't have any other kind of relationship with that individual other than the commissioning relationship. And obviously, because we commission it, there are other advantages, which are things like, the council will assure the quality of the care, etc., etc., etc. But other than that, we don't have any other.
Mrs. Wright.
It's just clarification, if I may. We're talking about banding 1 to 5, but there's also the standard nursing rate. I'm assuming, is that determined nationally? And if it is determined nationally, how are we going to make sure that the banding rates we're adjusting stay proportionate to that? Because I would have thought nursing care at a standard rate is more expensive than residential.
Right. The issues in nursing care are quite complex. The homes that are registered nursing homes, some of them are just nursing homes and some of them are dual registered, so they're registered for residential care and for nursing care. And the difference really is that where it's nursing care, the care needs to be carried out under the supervision of a nurse, qualified nurse. The people who are in nursing homes who are deemed to be eligible by the NHS to receive nursing care are entitled to receive a standard payment for that nursing care, which pays for part of the cost of the nursing care placement. And that's a figure set nationally. Off the top of my head, I can't remember exactly. It's about £120 a week, or something like that. That's a contribution that comes from the NHS to pay for their nursing care, and the council then pays for the rest of the cost of that placement based on its assessment about what the usual costs of providing care are. Now, in Leicestershire, we're relatively low users of nursing care. The number of residential placements is much higher than the number of nursing placements, but where individuals are in nursing homes, but they will receive the home will receive part of the payment, the larger part of the payment from the council if the person's eligible for publicly funded care. And everybody, not just people who are meeting the NHS figure is not means tested, so everybody who's eligible for NHS nursing care will receive the nursing payment. So that was a bit long-winded, but hopefully I managed to get the gist of that over.
So basically it will stay in proportion. That's what I'm trying to say. If we're adjusting our bandings, that element will stay in proportion to reflect the care that those people need.
No, I don't think it will, because the amount you receive, because the FNC, it's called, the payments comes from the NHS, is a set payment. It's the same in all parts of the country. It's a set sum, so there isn't a different sum for different people or different areas. It's a single sum that comes from the NHS. The amount the local authority pays does vary from area to area.
So what I'm trying to get at, that in a market, if we're paying lower for that and then the demand or they need more care, surely that will be affected. All I'm trying to say is, will the people on that banding be affected by what we're doing, in a nutshell?
Yes. So we're also establishing what the local authority contribution will be for people in residential nursing homes.
Right.
Sorry, I got the wrong end of that.
Mr. Harrison.
Thank you, Chairman. It's about the banding again. I'm a former nursing home operator in the past, so I have a little understanding. Residential was at a different level, ambulant, able to walk around. Nursing was what we'd call heavy work, toiletries, dressing, etc. So you've got that, and now you're bringing in this other band that at the beginning, those who aren't eligible for residential, who would be better off in their own home for as long as they could. Now am I beginning to understand how you're setting this up, that you'd have the early intervention is to help people stay in a home for as long as possible. The second level then would be into a residential accommodation, and then nursing, because I talk to people and they all think everything's all in one service, is the whole lot, fits everything. I know there's dual registrations and everything, but we're saying that people would be encouraged and helped to stay in their homes as long as possible. First trip would then be to the residential side. They're still ambulant, they can take medication, and they have reasonable control over their movements and life. Then the third element is the nursing, where you do need care, help, support, dressing, toiletring, medications, and a whole range, feeding and everything. Now, is that roughly where we are?
Yeah, I think that's broadly correct. I think we would want as few people as possible to go into 24-hour care setting, and we want as few people as possible to end up in nursing care. So the idea is to keep people as independent for as long as it possibly can. I think over the years, the frailty and the care needs of people in care homes have increased. So I think if you'd gone to a care home 10 years ago and went to a care home today, you'd see a very big difference in the level of frailty and care that people require in care homes. And certainly many people who are in care homes now, 10 years ago, would probably have been in a nursing home.
Right, thank you for that. I just think before we pass on from this one, the question, in fact, Sandy almost set us right at the start, was that this is going out to consultation next week. You have a copy of the proposed consultation questions. Just before we go on, are people happy with the consultation questions? Is there any comment that we can provide, Sandy, to help him? While we're happy with the consultation as it goes out? My personal comment would be I was delighted in the frequently asked questions to see the answers to 3 and 6. I think that's very reassuring for the public and providers on this, that this is not a cost-cutting exercise, and that we have very few closures of homes. So I think there's good news to take out of this as well, that we are getting a lot of things right. But to assist our officers, are people happy with the question that's provided?
Yes.
Mrs. Wright is dying to get in.
I'm sorry, Sandy, come back again. It's just clarification on that last point about the nursing. So is that in this so will it go to people who are on that banding? So will they have a chance, an opportunity to take part in the consultation if they are affected, as you've said?
Absolutely, and the consultation is aimed at nursing homes. I think we're not going to be writing to every single person in a care home. We're going to be really relying on other organisations to do that, so the care homes themselves to talk to residents and families, and advocacy organisations to represent the views of people. But the consultation is very much about residential care homes and residential nursing homes.
Ted.
Thank you. When you say that you've asked residential homes to disseminate the information, is that in what sort of way? Have you actually asked them that, you've requested, we would like you to do this, and can you feed back to us once you've done it? Or is it almost a hope that they'll do it?
It's very much an open consultation, so we're looking for anyone to contribute to it. The residents that we're contacting are people who have got what's called a deferred payment agreement, where the council's paying for their care pending the sale of their house, and we're actually specifically contacting those people because those people are directly affected by the fee decisions that we make. We're not contacting, I say, the individual residents themselves, but we are in the communications to care homes asking them to talk to residents, and particularly their families, about any comments that they have to make about what we're doing. But we actually don't know who all the residents are. We don't have their contact details. We don't know who the self-funders are. But we are asking them to do that, and we are also contacting all the representative bodies in Leicestershire and all the advocacy organisations, asking them to assist with that.
Yeah, I mean, in a subject as serious as this, you would expect, one would hope that you would get information back from all the homes. I mean, how realistic is that?
Well, obviously we are expecting to, I mean, we've already had a lot of engagement with the providers. There is M-Care, which is a representative body for all care homes, and we're working very closely with them. So they will, I'm sure, be assisting all their members in responding to us, as well as responding themselves as a collective organisation. So we are expecting to get a significant number of responses from care homes, and we've already got a provider reference group with already a number of providers who've been engaged for quite a long period working with us on these proposals.
And my final question, Chair, is has any other authority in the United Kingdom implemented a change, and is there any results, best practice, feedback available that's steering this?
Yeah, there are lots of authorities who've done this on many occasions, including ourselves, and we'll certainly be we've already done quite a lot of benchmarking and talking to other authorities, particularly our neighbouring authorities, because that's the biggest impact on the local care market. There's clearly a big link between the care market in the city and the county, and we're going to work very closely with our fellow local authorities.
Thank you for that, Sandy. So I think the assessment of the committee is, thank you for answering the questions, is that we are happy with the consultation as proposed, and we wait at a later date to see the results and the feedback to this committee. So we now move on to agenda item 9, which is capital investment into adult social care accommodation-based support services. And for this we have a presentation. It's included in the pack, but rather than Sandy just talk about the agenda item, he's going to give us a formal presentation.
Okay, first I say, are we blocking the screen sitting here?
I can see above you.
We're fine here, are we? Okay.
As long as you know what's behind.
Right. Okay. I'll do. I've got it in front of me here, so hopefully I've got to coordinate what I've got in front of me with what's behind me. So I might ask if you wanted to help me with that.
I can do some clicking.
I can now introduce my colleague Fiona McMahon, who has done quite a lot of the detailed work on this, and she'll be able to hopefully assist in answering any questions that the committee might have. So I'll take you fairly quickly through the early parts of the presentation and really concentrate on some of the proposals themselves. So I think just starting with what this is all about. So the report hopefully outlines that what the council is trying to do here is something that's quite new and different for us, which is to take a very active move in investing in people's accommodation needs in order to improve outcomes for people, but also to develop a model that's much more financially sustainable for the council. So what we're talking about here is something that's really big and strategic. If anything could qualify as big and strategic, it would be this. So I'll just start then, first of all, with the kind of case for change. So a lot of this is well rehearsed. We've got increasing demand caused by demographic pressures. Our strategy is to maximise people's independence by supporting people at home and avoiding the use for institutional care. We probably need to do things which are much more active to achieve that. And the Care Act requires us really to be involved in shaping the market and ensuring that there's adequate provision for people, including for self-funders, as we've outlined previously. But in reality, there's very limited public knowledge about what accommodation options are available for people, and people perhaps don't make the best choices. And there's also a limited supply of the kinds of accommodation that people will need, particularly for an ageing population. So what are our aims and objectives? Firstly, is to improve outcomes for people. And we know that getting people the right kind of accommodation has a major impact on improving their outcomes. We need to shape the market, so take active interventions to shape the market and ensure that there's sufficient capacity of the kinds of accommodation and support that people need. We need to manage growth and manage demand, and making sure people in the right accommodation is really key for us in doing that. And we need to contain cost pressures. This is really about the price that we pay for care. We need to ensure that that price is kept to something that's affordable for the council, and particularly the council ends up paying for a large amount of accommodation costs that perhaps it doesn't need to, that could be paid for in other ways. And there's also an opportunity to generate income if the council is a more active player in terms of developing accommodation, in terms of rental income. So how do we propose to deliver those aims? Really by developing and enabling housing and care options that are right for people, and that also fit with people's expectations, and also that are affordable to people. We need to facilitate new and innovative ways of doing that the old models of really relying on the market to do it for us aren't going to achieve really what we want to achieve. And we're probably going to have to work with partners to do that. This is not something that the council is likely to be able to do entirely on its own. And that will involve exploring the full range of market options that we have to do that. And we also need to really help everybody in Leicestershire to make the right kinds of decisions about their accommodation. So in terms of the types of accommodation, this is really showing this as a kind of hierarchy, inverse hierarchy of the kinds of accommodation options that people have. Firstly, there would be the kind of mainstream housing that we all live in. These are individual houses to buy or rent. So one of the things we want to do is really help developers to develop the kinds of accommodation which are appropriate given the kind of demographic changes we know are happening. There's very little accommodation, general needs accommodation being built which is fit for life, and there isn't enough accommodation which can be which people can remain in as they become older and frailer. Then as we move into the more specialised areas, the council will have a more direct influence on those. So specialist housing like sheltered housing, retirement housing, downsizing housing, we will be wanting to increase the supply of that. And then really where the specific investments will come in will be around specialist housing with support, so things like extra care, supported living for people, where the council will want to ensure that there is specific investment and may involve the council itself investing in those kinds of accommodation. And then lastly, there'll be registered accommodation, things like care homes and nursing homes. So in terms of some of the background population data, there's probably nothing that's very surprising about the graphs behind me. What they show is the usual graph, which shows a fairly slow but general increase in the overall population, but largely the numbers of younger adults remaining similar to what it is now, but big increases in the numbers of older people over the next 20 years. And the graph on the right is for people aged over 65. If you look at the graphs for people aged over 75 and over 85, the rise is even steeper. So we're getting big increases in the numbers of frail older people. Just really splitting that down by district, it's probably a bit too small for you to read, but I'm sure you can see it from the presentation itself, is really just showing current placements based on each district, which is really just showing the proportion of placements. So these are council-funded placements. So the numbers of self-funders is not included in that. These are the people that the council is funding, split between residential care, nursing care, supported living, extra care, and community services, which is people living in their own homes. And I think the key things to pick out from that are that there are shortages of supported living in Blaby, Harborough, Melton and North West Leicestershire, that there is currently an undersupply, and in fact no supply, of extra care in Hinckley and Bosworth, North West Leicestershire, Oadby and Wigston, but there's also a general undersupply of extra care housing across all areas of the county. So I think those are the key things from there. And that's based on current placements. Clearly, as the numbers of people requiring support increases, those gaps will become bigger over time unless we do something about it. Quite a busy slide this, but what it's doing is, and I think this is something that at a previous meeting you specifically said you wanted. It was a breakdown by district and borough of what our expectations are around the levels of care that and support the council would be looking to commission over a 20-year period. So it's based on position in 2017, then 10 years to 2027, and a further 10 years to 2037, which is really showing relatively modest increases in the numbers of people in nursing care, actual reduction in the number of people in residential care based on previously on wanting to support people in more independent options, but then very large increases in the volumes of supported living, which is supported living for younger adults under 65, and extra care, which is effectively the same thing but for older adults, where we're looking at very significant increases in the supply in each of the districts. And that's based on both the demographic changes that we think are going to happen, but also the policy changes. So if we move people away from residential care towards more independent alternatives, we're expecting that increase to be larger than the change just caused by the population. Okay, the next slide is saying, okay, if we are going to then put in place those increases in the number of people in supported living and the numbers of people in extra care, what would it cost to build that number of supported living placements and that number of extra care units? So this is based on what it would cost to do that. And again, so it's just really taking the number of units of each of those two services and saying that's what it would cost over, again, the 10-year and the 20-year period, which shows some very big numbers there. So we're looking at getting into the over 200 million of investment that would be required over a 20-year period, which is clearly a lot of money. I don't think we're necessarily saying that the council would provide all that investment. Some of that investment may come from private developers, some of it may come from partnership arrangements, but some of it may come from the council itself. Okay, the next slide is really trying to work out, I suppose, what the business case is for making that investment. based on what we think the revenue saving would be of making capital investment. And that's based on what we think the average saving would be generated from each unit of new accommodation that's developed. So what that's showing is the cumulative number of units that would be developed, what the ASC saving would be, so that would be what the adult social care saving would be in terms of the costs we would pay for people's care and support, the income generated, so if the council were to invest in that and with the landlord, the income that would be generated from rent, that would be paid either from individuals' own resources or from people's entitlement to benefits. And then showing what the return on that would be based on the level of investment as against the saving and additional income, which is showing the saving from supported living on this modelling would be 7.4%, extra care 4.5%, and actually the highest return would be invested in residential care. Now these are very much kind of outline figures. I don't think anyone is trying to say that's any kind of guaranteed return. I think everyone knows that what looks right on paper, can the devil will be the detail in terms of how that's worked out. But in terms of an outline business case, that's the best estimate of returns that we have, which is showing that there is clearly a cost to look further into developing those proposals. Okay. In terms of there are clearly other benefits from extra care and supported living, particularly in terms of maximising people's independence. It's showing that basically people get better and healthier in residential care than they do in extra care than they do in residential care, or they do if they are very frail and at risk of harm at home. So they produce very good outcomes for people, particularly if you design them right. So they produce real benefits in terms of people's outcomes and health and well-being, but also real outcomes in terms of saving costs, both for the council but also for other organisations, particularly in terms of people's use of NHS services. People are less likely to have falls, people are less likely to get ill, or more likely to get the support they need early on from primary care. So just in terms of options, there are a whole range of funding options, and I won't go through every one of these just in terms of time, but they're a mixture of council, right from the council making its own investments to joint ventures, developers funding, housing companies, working with Homes for England, working with district councils, and Section 106 developer contributions. And a range of build and delivery options which range really from different kinds of levels of partnership that we could have with another organisation or organisations in terms of doing that. And I'll say a bit more later on about how we're exploring which of those options we want to pursue. We are looking to learn from other areas. This is not the first time this has ever been done. There are a number of other authorities who are doing significant work in developing their accommodation offer. We've looked at North Yorkshire, Warwickshire, Worcestershire, Oxfordshire, I think, and also Cornwall, who are doing a big development in extra care. So we're really keen to learn from that, and there is significant learning. And we are, in terms of developing things like extra care, we're by no means trailblazers here. There are other parts of the country who have a very much more developed extra care offer than we have. Okay, in terms of next steps, this is a little bit out of date because this is was done before we went to Cabinet. So Cabinet agreed that we should issue a prior intention notice to engage with the market, and that was issued on the 24th of October. to outline the estimated future demand, to test the market interest in developing the models which we've outlined, to test whether we've set out the right kinds of outcomes and success criteria, and to test the assumptions that we've made. We've contacted the other authorities. We're looking at the established the resource requirements, and we're going to be developing a full business case which will be going back to Cabinet later next year. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sandy. Mrs. Newton.
When I was at Charnwood Borough Council, because I'm a great believer in lifetime homes, but at times there's often quite a resistance from developers to actually build enough lifetime homes. Can you tell me if the market has changed? Is there more of an appetite for lifetime homes, or are you still having to do a lot of negotiations with developers?
Well, I think probably there's not been a sea change. And I think if you look at the kinds of accommodation that are being built across the country today, they're by and large not lifetime homes, and there is still an under-development of retirement housing, of housing that's fit for lifetime. I think it's changing, but it's changing very slowly, and there just isn't enough. And a lot of what's there isn't really affordable for lots of people either. So I think one of the things we're doing within the market engagement is really testing what is the appetite to do that. And I think it'll only change when there's a kind of when developers really see the scale of the financial opportunity. And I'm sure if they see the scale of the financial opportunity that there is to develop for housing for the people who actually have the assets, then I think things will change. But I don't think it's changing anything like as quick as it needs to at the moment. One of the issues will have a long legacy issue, because the housing that's been built now is going to be around in 50 years' time.
Please follow up with that. And just to ask, I mean, I walk every day on the set of railway tracks. I'm watching a big housing development being built. I've watched it since the first bricks went in, and I just wonder what is being done in partnership with the councils, the borough and other councils who have responsibility for planning. What work's being done to try and ensure that enough recognition is given to the need of this type of housing?
We're beginning to have more of an understanding now of the requirements that we've got. We're beginning to have very detailed conversations with district and borough councils around local planning. And Fiona has particularly been doing some work with colleagues in the Chief Exec's department around things like Section 106 contributions, where traditionally there hasn't been an adult social care element. We've had education and we've had libraries and but we've not had an adult, so we're beginning to think about that now, and Fiona might want to comment about kind of what we're thinking about in terms of that. I think to be fair, we're at an early stage of that. As Sandy said, there are other authorities who are in a much more advanced position than we are in terms of thinking about accommodation-based care and the impact that accommodation has on people's future care needs. So it is something that we are in the early stages of, and we're certainly by no means got this cracked. But Fiona, do you want to add anything about the Section 106 and the work you've been doing?
And it really picks up on what you were asking about the lifetime home standards. So one of the things that we're looking at within Section 106 is a contribution where a home isn't to the lifetime home standards, because we know that then costs even more money when it needs adaptation. So getting a downstairs bathroom, getting a straight staircase is easier than to put the social care in. We're also looking at, from the needs analysis that we've done, where an area isn't providing in a new development either enough supported living or extra care, a contribution, so that we can then develop that in a different way.
Very quickly, Fiona, could you send me some information on that, because I'm very, very interested in that side of things. Thank you.
Mrs. Wright.
Will there be a criteria set for extra care? So will you need to have a need for so many hours of social care a week to be able to enter, or will it be a mixture? How do you see that working?
Well, I think it kind of depends on the nature of the scheme, actually, because there's nothing to stop anyone from building an extra care scheme. And many are. I mean, there are many different models of extra care. So there are developers now building entirely privately funded sheltered and extra care housing. They're not coming to the council asking for a contribution. They're not asking us to give them a contract for providing care. So for those schemes, you know, it's entirely there for the developer and the landlord to set what the eligibility criteria are, and by and large, they're kind of whether you're prepared to buy the flat or not. Where the council is developing it, is making a financial contribution to it, and where there would be a care and support contract, the council would then establish what the eligibility was, and would have nominations rights in relation to it. And we'd clearly want to be targeting at the people that we think would get the maximum benefit from it, and also the people that we are avoiding moving into more institutionalised care. So I think it really depends on the nature of the scheme, but we're very kind of keen that private developers should be developing those schemes as well. We think there should be choice available to people, and that people should choose options that are right for them.
Mr. Kaufman.
Chair, I welcome this. I think it's the right thing for the county council to enter into this market and sort of lead it. But it wasn't too many years ago that we were sitting here trying to flog off everything that the council owned in social care, and couldn't get rid of the residential homes quick enough because we didn't have the money to make them up to a modern standard. And it's amazing how we've gone full circle, haven't we? I assume that the reason we become more viable is because of the minimum wage, or whatever the latest title is for the minimum wage, is that the private care owners now have to pay above a minimum wage. So we're now viable and in the same market. I assume we came out of it originally because we were paying a proper wage and the people in the private sector were paying whatever the market would stand. But I really do welcome this, and I hope your figures are right. I'm not an accountant, but I really hope these figures are right, because if we can sort of lead the market and get something like this going, it's progress.
Yes, just to respond, there's certainly the market has changed since the development and the implementation of the minimum wage and the living wage, absolutely. And the pay differentials between what were local authority services and what are independent sector or private sector services have certainly changed. At this stage, we're not assuming that we will directly deliver the services. So what we're suggesting at this stage is that the county council would want to invest in the bricks and mortar rather than the delivery. Now, we're not excluding the county council delivering services, and part of the intention to kind of engage with the market is to have a conversation, a dialogue with the market about that whole process. But at this stage, it's more about saying actually a good deal of the cost of the revenue cost to the county council of residential care or other forms of care and support that have an accommodation attached to them, a good deal, 40, sometimes more % of that cost is bricks and mortar. So we're not paying for the direct care costs there, we're paying for organisations, sometimes independent sector or private sector companies who have invested in bricks and mortar. They then want a return, often in a very short period of time, so they might take out 10-year loans or 10-year mortgages on a £5 million development. That cost then we have to bear as part of our revenue commitment through the individual fees that we pay. That cost never goes down, I have to say. When they've paid their mortgage and their fees and their loans off, we continue paying that amount. It never actually goes down. All we're saying is that actually we could make an impact on our revenue position if we weren't paying high costs for bricks and mortar for the property development side of the business. We could also potentially, if we were to then lease buildings to partners, either through a joint venture or through another arrangement, we could potentially make an income. So it's not just about saving on the revenue budgets, but actually we could also derive an income which then offsets some of that revenue spend. So it's a different approach. So Chris Tambini, the 151 officer, often kind of explains this as saying, we're going to pay for this one way or another. Over the next 20 years, we will pay for it through our revenue budgets, we'll pay for it through the fees that we pay for care, or we'll pay for it upfront through capital and save on the revenue position. So it's a balance.
Mrs. Fryer.
Thank you very much. I really welcome this report. I think it's a great idea to look at all other options and things, and it makes perfect sense to me that if we can invest in the bricks and in getting with partnership working, the risk to the council is lessened than if we're running the nursing homes, care homes. The risks to the council are far greater and are far more costly. I think we're now nearly a quarter of a way through the 21st century, and I really do think we have to start looking outside the box. There are different ways of building, there are different ways of making houses suitable for life, if that is what people want. I don't know that when I'm 90 I will still want to be living in my 3-bedroomed house with a lift and a 100-yard garden. I won't. So I do think we really do. I was at a conference earlier this year about rural services network, and there were people there talking about the new methods of building. We are so backward in this country that we still think we have to do bricks and mortar. You could get care homes, nursing homes, bungalows built by using the Hof system, or what they do in Sweden and Germany, much quicker, and they are so efficient that you're meeting every criteria. So everything you're looking at, I fully endorse, and I think it's a great paper. Just what we should be getting ahead and leading here in this part of the world.
Mr. Crooks.
Thank you, Chairman. On page 24, it talks about, down the bottom, talks about councils, authorities, local authorities going into the building as private companies. And I know at Hinckley and Bosworth we were looking at this a couple of years back, and we were well down the road of doing it, and then all of a sudden we were told it wasn't viable. I just wondered whether there were any others in Leicestershire that were doing it. That's my first quick question. Then on page 27, the top item, 16, obviously I welcome it like all the other councillors. I just wonder, given the fact that private companies are struggling to make it work and getting into trouble because of appalling standards, because they've been cost cutting and what have you, how we think that, well, I hope we can sort it out, but I just wondered how we think that we can do better than that. And then on 35, it talks about 339 people being outside the county for residential care. Is that because we can't provide the spaces, or is that because that's choice?
I've forgotten all the questions were actually. I'll answer the last question first while I kind of regroup. I think we've dealt with that in terms of the previous item. So those are the people who placed, the majority of whom are in the city, and the rest are spread out elsewhere. I think we would want as many people as possible to receive support local to their community. So we don't want to transplant and relocate people from one end of the county to the other. So I think what we're definitely trying to do here is to ensure that there is sufficient supply to enable people to remain close to where the community that they know. I think your second question about was the how do we know that we can do this properly, I suppose. I think that's why we're doing market engagement. So that's the process we're going through now. So we've issued a notice asking for partners to or potential partners to engage with us and talk about what we've done so far, whether they think it's realistic, what they think about our options, and what they think of those options are realistic. So we will be talking to developers, we'll be talking to housing associations, we'll be talking to other landlords, we'll be talking to care providers, we'll be talking to the planning authorities in each of the districts, so that we come up with options that actually people have confidence in, that they are viable, and that they can be done, and they will meet, I suppose, everyone's expectations. So until we've kind of done that engagement work, I don't think we'll know which of those options are the best ones and the ones that we want to pursue. But whatever we do will have to be based on a robust business case. So unless we have a robust business case, and unless that's really past kind of all due diligence, the council will not be proceeding with it. And your first question is there anywhere else in the
Housing company.
Looking at housing companies. I can't actually tell you where there are any, if there are any locally. I don't know if.
The city are moving that way. The city are moving that way, not any other than county, but we are also talking to some of the London boroughs which have gone down that route. Cornwall are going down that route. There are an awful lot of local authorities that are at different stages in the journey, so we're able to get quite a lot of learning from those which are more advanced than us.
Thank you for that. I'm interested from my point of view. I would urge caution over the housing companies. Most of the London ones are technically illegal if you look at the way they've been set up. And councils can do this under their own auspices without a housing company anyway. We're legally entitled to, so it's not an issue. I'll just come to page 40, funding options. I just think I would urge the council not to ignore opportunities from people who may want to donate. I mean, Oak Court in Blaby came about because of a substantial anonymous donation. And there are lots of charities and funds out there that might actually have surplus funds across the county. I'm certainly aware of, in the harbour area, of one fund alone that fails to spend even its interest each year, who might be interested in making donations. But my question on funding options relates to the NHS. The NHS get money each year to build homes. They never build any. Can we not have a linkage with the NHS to actually get some of that money off them to put into the funding options?
Certainly we will be talking, and we are talking to colleagues in the NHS, because clearly it's a health and care and housing system. So we need to make sure that we've got the right services in place. Particularly if we're going to be building a new extra care facility, we need to ensure we've got the right amount of primary care, we've got the right amount of community services to support people. And obviously we want to make sure that whatever we're doing as a county council, we're doing in tandem and is aligned to any strategy the NHS may have around community hospital reconfigurations or other kind of bed models that they may be looking at. Whether or not they would be prepared to invest is another matter altogether. Although, not only do the NHS do, capital funding in the NHS at the moment is quite difficult to get hold of, I have to say. But the NHS do also own a lot of land in Leicestershire. So, there are different ways that organisations can contribute.
Thank you for that, John. I think, to paraphrase, the committee are extremely supportive of this paper. We're very excited about it. We fully concur with the decision made by Cabinet to pursue this, and we look forward to being kept up to date with progress on what we all believe, I think if I talk for all of us, to be a very exciting opportunity and proposal that's come forward. So thank you very much for that. We'll now go on to agenda item 10, which is Adult Social Care Target Operating Model, and it's with you, John.
Thank you, Chair. So this is a report which is detailing some work that was undertaken by the Council with a strategic partner over the summer, and is essentially looking at how the Council delivers its services and the operating model that we use within adult social care. So within the department, we've been working, as you know, for the last 2 years to develop and implement our adult social care strategy, and we've been quite successful over the last 2 years in promoting people's independence, in reducing, delaying, preventing the need for care, but also in terms of the way that we meet people's needs once needs have been identified. As part of that process, though, it's not all about how we deliver care to individuals, although that's obviously the most important factor. It's also about how we operate as a department, the way that people work, the way that we approach the work, the decisions that are made within the department, and whether or not we're working as effectively and efficiently as we possibly can be, whilst ensuring that people's outcomes are met. So that was the context to the work that was started in the summer. And we invited an external organisation in. They came in at the end of July. They worked with the department over the course of a couple of months through August and into September. And they undertook a diagnostic assessment of where they thought that the County Council could improve the outcomes to individuals, but also at the same time become a more efficient organisation. So the work that they did was to have a look at, I think they said they looked at over 1 million lines of data, financial and activity data. They met with frontline staff. They undertook case reviews with frontline staff. They did workshops with staff. They met with some of our providers. They undertook benchmarking against other authorities. And they came to a view of where they thought the council was performing well and where they thought there were opportunities for further development. So they recognised that we are an efficient council. They recognised that we have a good track record of delivering transformational change and that we had a good, clear vision for social care. They noted the range of efficiencies that we'd already implemented over the course of the last few years. And they looked at various elements of transformation that we'd undertaken. They also identified areas where they thought we could improve further. And from a number of areas, they really honed down on 7 areas that they thought that we could make a substantial difference to the outcomes for people in Leicestershire, whilst at the same time potentially becoming a more productive organisation. And those 7 areas are broadly categorised in the report, paragraph 22, as being improvements to reablement and enablement. So reablement is the process we go through with older adults, particularly after they've suffered a period of ill health, perhaps a hospital admission, where we try and get people sort of back to being as able as they can be. People don't always get back to the same level of function that they had before. Some people do. But we try our best to get people functioning to their maximum. Enablement is more about people who perhaps are younger adults with disabilities, learning disabilities, autism, mental health issues, where perhaps they didn't always have those skills to begin with, but we're trying to develop their skills in daily living. So there are 2 areas that they thought we could do more on. They thought we could reduce some of the variation in practice within the authority and improve decision making by frontline practitioners, and that would have an impact on the outcomes that people receive. And they thought that there were just improved ways of working within the department, particularly within sort of the back office and within the way that staff operate sort of administratively, if you like. So those opportunities were then looked at by the department and by corporate colleagues. We undertook a gateway review. We tested those opportunities to see whether we thought that they were viable. We looked at the validation in terms of the activity and performance information and the finance. And we looked at how we felt that those opportunities could be delivered. And paragraph 25 and 26 outline 7 areas where we think there is a good opportunity for the council moving forward. So the first of those is around reablement. So this is ensuring that everybody who could benefit from reablement has access to a reablement service. And what the external partners said to us was we could potentially make a 20% increase in the number of people who receive reablement in the county. And not only could we receive a 20% increase in the numbers of people that get reablement, but actually we could improve the outcomes for the people who go through that process in such a way that when that reablement process is ended, they would require less formal care than they do now. The second area was around consistent decision making. And essentially this goes back to the conversation we've just had around the accommodation-based care, because what effectively we were saying was people are not always in the right setting of care. So we have people who are in residential care who don't need to be in residential care. And we have people who are being admitted to residential care who, with a bit more thought, a bit more creativity, a bit more support for the frontline staff, different decisions could be made about whether or not those people could be supported more independently at home. There was also an area of work that they looked at in terms of how people operate, so how staff operate, and the amount of time that staff actually have available to them, for example, to spend in direct conversation with people who use services and families. The amount of time that they spend on administrative tasks, the amount of time they spend inputting data, the amount, etc., etc., etc. And they said that we could make improvements to the amount of time that people had available to them, which would then allow for some of those more creative conversations to take place, and would also allow for the authority to undertake more regular reviews of people's care, which would again lead to improved outcomes for people. And at the moment, as an authority, we only review around about 60% of the people that we serve every year. So 40% of people every year are not getting a review of their social care needs, and part of this whole process was to say, actually, if you freed up staff time from administration and other duties, that you could undertake those reviews and therefore improve the quality of care for people. So one example of that was around reablement, and as part of the work, as I said, the consultants did with us, they undertook workshops with staff, with frontline staff, and they took staff through existing cases. So these are not kind of things that they've plucked out of the air or things that they've brought in from other areas. These are our own existing cases, and they then took staff through what was happening for the individual and talked to staff about whether there were other options and what a good outcome would have looked like for people. One of those was a person a lady that we're calling Sarah. It was a 74-year-old lady. She was receiving reablement through our internal heart service. She'd been in hospital, she was coming out of hospital, she had 3 calls a day to help her with personal care and medication. That started off very well on day 1. By day 7, when the carers called, Sarah had already eaten. She was fine, and she made herself a meal, which was good, absolutely. She was being reabled, didn't need the help of carers. By day 9, she declined support on a morning call, which was helping her with dressing and getting out of bed. And when the lunchtime call went in, she'd eaten her lunch, so she was beginning now to take much more responsibility. And by day 10, she declined all assistance. We didn't step the care down until day 17. We could have stepped the care down at day 7. We could have begun to gradually decline, but we kept the care in because obviously we were concerned. We wanted to make sure that she was getting there and this was sustainable, so we kept the care in. But actually, what would have been better for Sarah would have been to step the care down at the point that she was beginning to make those decisions for herself. So that's kind of one example of, actually we had a 10-day period there where we were probably providing too much care. Now, our average reablement episode is about 3.5 weeks in Leicestershire. So reablement, as you probably know, is an up to 6 week period. In Leicestershire, we tend to reable people within 3.5 to 4 weeks. That's our kind of average. What the consultants were saying is you could probably get that down to 2.5 to 3 weeks. That then frees up a lot of capacity to take new people through the system. The other problem we've got in Leicestershire is that it sometimes takes us a while to hand the care on then to the mainstream home care provider. And it might take up to 2 weeks in some cases for the home care providers to be in a position to take that care on. And that's obviously because, as we've discussed around the committee before, there are significant challenges in ensuring that we've got the right capacity in the home care sector, and for those home care providers to be able to employ sufficient carers, etc., is a challenge. One of the other areas that the consultants looked at was the difference between the internal home reablement service and the external providers. So the internal service works with everybody coming out of hospital. The external providers work with people in the community who require reablement. The outcomes are very different. So whilst the internal service costs more per hour to deliver, the outcomes for the individual tend to be better than the independent sector. And by better, I mean people have less requirement for ongoing care. There's also quite a lot of variation between the independent sector providers, between the different reablement outcomes from the different providers across the county. So it's not, depending on where you live in the county, might depend on how effective your reablement service was. So what they were saying was, if you free up some of these hours within the reablement service, some of that work that's been undertaken by the independent sector could be undertaken by the in-house service, which would improve outcomes for people. It would also mean that there would be more capacity in the independent sector because they wouldn't be doing the reablement work. They would be able to take people much more quickly on transfer from the heart service. So you start to have a very different model of the way that care flows through the system and the way that people receive their care. That's just kind of one example of the reablement episode. The same was true for working age adults. Paragraph 26 details some of the work there. One of the areas there that they looked at was around enablement, about how we enable people with disabilities to have more independent lives. There's also something there about whether people are in the right setting of care again, consistent decision making, about whether or not people could have their care needs stepped down more effectively, and how often, and this goes back to the issue around reviewing, how often we review people's care and ensure that we are not creating dependency within that sector. So as an example of a piece of work that they did with staff, they worked with one of our younger adult staff groups, and they looked at a case of a chap who, 32-year-old chap who'd been living in supported living for 11 years. And he was quite independent in many ways. He got out a lot. He did a lot of activities, a lot of swimming, a lot of football, volunteered in his local area. He could get himself out to see his family, who lived in a different district, so he'd get the bus and get himself there and back. But he needed support on a daily basis around some of his care needs and his personal care needs. And they talked to a group of staff about how much support this chap needed. So the first staff member said, well, I think he needs sort of 6 hours of one-to-one care every day. A week, not every day. 6 hours of one-to-one care a week. And the second person said, yes, I would agree with 6 hours of one-to-one care, but I think he also needs some support at night, so we probably need to put a sleeping member of staff in at night to make sure that he's okay. And then the third person said, well, the 6 hours is probably about right, but he'd be much better off in shared lives than he would in supported living with a family. The actual support this chap got was 10 hours a week with night staff. He'd been in care for a number of years, but because his needs hadn't been reviewed as regularly as they should have been, he was being over-provisioned with care. When they got the 3 members of staff together and put them in a group and said, so this is what you've all looked at, first person said this, second person, what do you think the ideal scenario is, they actually came out with 4 hours of care. So this was an example of whether or not we're making the best decisions for people, and the way that people work and the way that we ask our frontline staff to operate, because it's high pressure work in the front line. You know, there's a lot of work. There's always work coming through the front door. Staff are doing the best job that they possibly can, but they don't always have the time and space to be able to reflect and to think, and not always supported in the right way to be able to develop the most imaginative and care plans for people. So this is about a different culture, changing the culture of the way that we work as an organisation and where decisions are made, and giving staff more, empowering staff to be able to make different decisions for people. So that improves the outcomes for people, but not only does it improve outcomes, but potentially for the council it creates a financial dividend, because if we're being able to step people's care down more quickly, when they're at a point where they can live more independently, then obviously that's beneficial to the council. So part of the work that we're doing is to estimate what that benefit might be. And if you look at paragraph 27, there's an outline there of what we think the overall benefit may be to the council. So a cashable benefit there of 7.8 million. 2.3 million of that we think is already within our MTFS saving plan. But that still leaves £5.5 million of potential cashable saving, along with a £2.7 million worth of what we're calling quality improvement. So the 2.7 million is the amount of, if you look at the amount of staff hours that could be freed up by working differently, and then you put a monetary value to that, it comes to 2.7 million. So, you know, in theory, you could take that out as a cashable saving. What we're saying is, no, we don't want to take that out as a cashable saving. We want to leave that in because that's where the quality improvement comes from. So, we will be seeking to take a report to Cabinet on the 23rd of November, which will detail those findings, and it'll ask Cabinet to approve an implementation plan against those assessed areas. That implementation plan would be carried out over the next 18 months. It would be a combination of internal resources and with some external support in order to ensure that the change is embedded fully within the organisation. And our anticipation is that within 18 months, we would be delivering a different model of support through the new target operating model. Thank you.
Thank you, John, and thank you for bringing that to life with a couple of actual examples. I know we talked about it earlier, but I think it really does help us as the committee to understand the differences. Do I have any questions? Mr. Cortland.
Thank you, Chair. I found that interesting, and as the Chairman said, to hear about real people makes it more understanding. On the previous session of the county, when I was on this committee sort of 3 or 4 years ago, I chaired a subcommittee that looked into the provision of home care. And one of the things that happens was the number of home care providers was dramatically reduced. There were some problems on the first few weeks when it was introduced, but I assume it's going ahead, but and it's working. But one of the things that was insisted upon was that the contract with the home carers would not be just paid so much an hour, go in and do whatever it is, but you were paid basically on what you achieved. If I remember correctly, it was if you get somebody walking quicker. One of the things with a home carer, if I understand it correctly, is if you're too successful, you lose the business. Because if you've got a contract to go to somebody for 3 weeks and you achieve it in 2 weeks, you sort of lose a week's worth of work. So in order to encourage people or the providers to get what you want, there was some sort of implementation of some sort of bonus that if you achieved that. And that was interesting, I think, because when you were talking about the way the heart that our internal providers, you were saying basically they did a better job. Or the outcome was better, but it was more expensive, I understand. So I just wondered, have we actually reviewed the implementation of this policy where we insisted that there are at least 2 providers per district? Has anybody actually looked back and seen whether what you tried then is succeeding and how it will apply to this?
Yes, indeed. So we've had a couple of reviews. The first one was we had an organisation an external organisation, the Institute for Personal Care from Oxford Brookes University, who we invited in to undertake an evaluation of the Help to Live at Home model and how it had been implemented and the outcomes from that. And that was very useful to us. We also did an internal review, and then of course we've got this review. So we've had 3 in total, and we think we brought a report to the last committee on the outcomes from the IPC report, and we developed a kind of a short-term and medium-term action plan against those outcomes. And of course, we're now 2 years into that contract, which means it's kind of got, it was a 3-year contract with potential to extend for another 1 or 2 years. So being 2 years in, we're now thinking about what happens next. So colleagues are currently working on what the future model for domiciliary care contracting will be, and this work feeds into that. The market's a funny thing, isn't it? And it doesn't always behave as you think it's going to. So you're absolutely right. When we developed the Help to Live at Home, when the Help to Live at Home contracts were developed, they were developed in such a way as to allow for 2 rates of pay. One for the reablement episode and one for the maintenance work. And the view was that reablement would be more intensive and would generate a higher hourly rate. And it would be in providers' interests to do as much reablement as they could, because there would be a higher hourly rate for that work, and therefore that would encourage turnover, it would encourage them to reable people and then get the next person and so forth. Market didn't always work like that, actually. Because what a lot of the providers did was they put in lower rates for reablement, or some of the providers did was put lower rates for it as a market leader, if you like. So actually, some providers' behaviour in terms of the contract and in terms of winning the contract was different to what we would have anticipated. Not in all cases. Some providers have higher hourly rates for reablement, some providers have lower hourly rates for reablement. But what's important is not the cost to us in terms of the hourly rate. What's important to us as an authority is the outcome. So what's important is if a person comes in and has a requirement for 20 hours of care a week at the start of the reablement episode, what's important to us is what the person's requirement for care is at the end of the reablement episode. Because the reablement episode is only going to last up to 6 weeks. The maintenance care could last for a number of years. So we want to ensure that people are as independent as possible at the end of that episode, and that's where the variability comes. Some providers are very good at it, some providers are not as good at it. And what's unacceptable is that your outcomes at the end of reablement would depend on where you lived within the county, as opposed to the service that you were offered, if you like. So there's 2 issues. One is, are people as independent as they can be? And what's the cost to the county council of that variation? And the second issue is whether or not people in one area of the county might not have quite the same experience as people in another area of the county.
Mr. Harrison.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Terrific report. Once the smart thinking starts, there's no end to it. And I think by looking at the 8 million savings, but I'm also interested in the better life that people are having, because what we're doing is much more, I'll say professional, but certainly beneficial, because once somebody is empowered to be able to do more things in their life, that's adding richness to their life. So we're getting a double bonus from this. We're helping the public live a better life, a more enjoyable and meaningful life, and we're saving 8 million. Well done. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mrs. Newton.
Yes, but the one thing I'm worried about is continuity across all the different services and the different providers. Some providers will be better delivering the service than others. What checks and balances do we have in place to ensure that the recipients of the service have the same level of care?
No, absolutely right, and this report highlights that. I think obviously we have quality improvement services that work with providers. The home care market is, not unlike the residential care market. There are providers who have very high quality. There are providers who are more challenged in providing quality services. We work obviously with those that we feel have the most challenges. And we have an intensive programme of support for those providers, and we work with colleagues in the NHS and CQC to make sure that people have the best outcomes that they can. I think it will always be the case that there will be some variation, simply because if you have we have 300 organisations providing care in Leicestershire. There will always be some variation. But of course, our duty and our responsibility is to make sure that everybody that is receiving care gets the best care possible, and that's obviously what we're working towards, and I think this is another way of trying to achieve that.
All right, thank you. I sense from members, and you'll tell me if I'm wrong, that again we find this an extremely exciting report. I think again we would recommend that Cabinet would actually adopt this report and carry on, and as members have said, and John himself has said, put the needs of the residents at the heart of what we're doing. The savings are substantial and should not be ignored, but I think John has put it correctly that this is about outcomes for our residents, which actually benefits us financially because of those outcomes, and we would therefore urge Cabinet not to look to make any savings but to take this in its entirety. Thank you. We'll now move on to the final item before lunch, which is agenda item 11, which is progress with smart library implementation. I'll give Nigel a chance to sit down. This is an update on work that's been undertaken. We've had several reports on smart libraries to this committee. So over to you, Nigel.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, everybody. So, as has been said, this is just to update you on the progress with the implementation of the technology across our major libraries in the county. Just a reminder that the technology enables people to swipe their access into the building to get in and out, and provide self-service kiosks, which have been operational in our libraries for a number of years now, to borrow, return and renew items, including the payment of charges, without staff support. This enables us to extend unstaffed opening hours by about 30 hours a week per library, and enables us to deliver a saving of around 230,000 through reduction in staffing hours, but having targeted staffing hours when people who might not choose to use smart libraries want to do so. So we last came to this committee in around September, which reporting on the pilot, and approval was given by Cabinet in September to roll this out, September 2017. So between April and October of this year, we've installed the technology in 10 of the 14 libraries that we're planning to do this in, and those are detailed in paragraph 10. And the installation for the remaining 4 libraries will be due to complete by the end of the year. As part of, whilst we were implementing the technology in the buildings, we did some customer and stakeholder engagement from July to August, where we said this is where, based on current patterns of usage, we think we could staff, or we would propose to staff libraries, and the details of that engagement are in paragraphs 21 to 24 of your report. And as a result of that, we tweaked the hours in some of the libraries based on some of the comments that we got back. And Appendix C of your report details what the current hours are for each library and what the proposed mixture of smart and staffed hours are. There are currently 2 libraries out of 16 major libraries where installation isn't currently possible, and those are Market Harbour and Melton Mowbray. We knew right from the beginning that Market Harbour, because of its shared usage within part of shared space and the location of the museum within that building, it was not going to be possible to safely adapt the building. And Melton Mowbray, we, as part of this process, where we were the leaseholder, had to seek permission from the landlord of each building, where we didn't own it, to seek permission for the installation. And at Melton Mowbray, where the landlord is Melton Brooksby College, they said that we would prefer you not to do that. However, we are having positive discussions with the college about alternatives, which may or may not in the future mean that we are able to adapt the building depending on what the outcome of that will be. But it's too early at this point to anticipate what that will be. We've got meetings scheduled with them before the end of the year where they're looking at their asset profile, what they want to do with their campus in the future. So a report regarding the progress on this implementation and the recommendations of what we would do with Market Harbour and Melton will be submitted to Cabinet in February 19. But based on the information that this report gives you, we do remain on schedule to deliver the 230,000 in savings from a capital investment of 800,000. And that gives us a range of financial and non-financial benefits and increases public access to our sites by about 30 hours a week as part of the project. So we're inviting you as a committee to comment on the progress and the implementation. Thank you.
Thank you, Nigel. Mrs. Fryer.
Thank you very much, Nigel. They're probably niggly comments, but I'd like to draw your attention to page 72, which is the frequently asked questions sort of thing. When will my library be closed, etc., etc. And for the implementation of the smart kiosk. And it says 2 to 3 weeks, and people will be told 6 weeks in advance when it is. And it will be through notices in the library, on the website and social media. Do we also make use of the county councillors, because we can spread information quite far and wide in our own areas, and also in the press? I mean, I'm not expecting you to have to pay large money, but in quite a lot of areas, editors are always looking for news, and quite like to put information in. So that was the thing, and also to make sure that the dates are circulated to everyone, because a lot of us, and I'm sure all councillors around this, in this committee and in this council, send out newsletters or in conversations, and we could be a good way of promoting it. The other one is on page 75 onwards. I'm quite intrigued that every evening in the charts has a little star beside it. Now, normally, a star means you've got to look for further information somewhere in the report. It means, Hilary Fryer raised this comment and ignore it, sort of thing. But I did go through it because I was looking for more exciting news. I'm presuming it's just to highlight they're all smart, but then we know that because it says so. So I'm sorry, but it's quite nice to have something different to comment on. But seriously, great report, great idea. Thank you.
I'd love to be able to give you the secret of the magical star. I think it was originally part of stuff that we'd looked at internally and a note to ourselves to remind ourselves. But I will check on that, and by the time it gets to cabinet, we'll amend that. Just in terms of picking up on the circulation of opening hours and so on, we do release, we draft press releases and give them to the press in terms of, particularly if it's in the local area. Obviously, it's up to them as to whether they do run it or not, and we do know that they have done. And in terms of local patch members, then in terms of when it's going to happen in their patch, we will contact them individually just to let them know. We obviously, sort of release that information as and when it's required.
Could I possibly suggest that besides the patch or division member, it also actually went not to all councillors or to something, because, for example, and I'm sure other councillors around this table will remark, if you do it by patch, for example, Loughborough, you're going to send it to one councillor, the information about their library closing, whereas there are far more than one councillor in that area. I'm not in Loughborough, but I know people that use the library from my division all the time in my village. So I think maybe almost by borough, so we can make the information go out wider, rather than by, or district, rather than just one councillor that covers an area. Thank you.
Yes, we did actually have drafted out a members' news in brief at one point where we were going to circulate that to everybody, but I think at the time we thought it might be better and easier just to contact that, but we can revisit that. It's drafted. We can just issue it, yeah.
Might I suggest as well that we use the parish councils, because they do have lots of, where they have one, because they have lots of local notice boards, which are very well read if we were just to send them a notice. Mr. Parton.
Thank you. So, the first point is I'm very pleased to see that as a result of the comments received in the consultation, that there has been an amendment to the opening. The day that will be smart all day has been changed to a Wednesday. I was very heavily lobbied about that, so I can't thank you enough. Please don't seem as if this is being rather pedantic, but I noticed that the format for this presentation is that you have a library in an area, say for example above Loughborough you've got Hinckley, and you have a chart that shows current opening hours and then a chart for opening hours and how it will be staffed, whether it will be smart or staffed. Loughborough doesn't have one. All it does is have the projected hours. It doesn't actually have its current hours. So as a comparator, it's a bit difficult to see.
The reason for that is Loughborough's not been adapted yet. We've done the engagement with, at the time when, sort of just during the adaptation of the building. So we've tended to do that before and just afterwards. So it's probably the reason why Loughborough isn't yet, because it's just about to be looked at.
And so the report says that the expected closing time will be 9:30, 21:30. Will that be automated, or will somebody actually have to physically lock the building?
What happens is when it's in smart mode, so at the end of the day, there will be an announcement to people using the library that they'll have to leave the library. What happens then is the building locks down, and then you can't get in. So obviously, we get asked this question a lot, if you're in the building after it's locked down, you just set the alarm off, and then we have to come out and get you out.
My last question is, could you explain what the situation is with the staff in terms of, I know we're saying that from April 2019 the contracts have been rewritten, but I take it staff are any being made redundant in terms of their hours currently? How do they compare going forward?
Yeah, clearly, the saving is made by reduced staffing contracts, and staff are just at the closing stages of a HR action plan, so that we're made them aware of what the new contract availability is. In terms of redundancies, we're not anticipating that there will be any, mainly because we've known that the impact of this for a while, and we've been very stringent in terms of vacancy management, so that throughput at this level of library assistant level is quite I'm trying to think of the word, is quite robust. There's a yeah, thank you, that's the word I was looking for. The turnover is quite active, so we've been able to make sure that as far as we possibly can there'll be very few, if any, staff redundancies, but obviously it will mean for some people that contracts will be reduced as a result of this, because that's how we're making the saving.
So, for example, what would an average worker, how many hours would they do now, and how many hours will they do next year?
Haven't got the exact detail of that, but I know that if we took the full-time equivalent as a whole, and we hadn't have vacancy managed, we would have lost around 12 full-time equivalents from this process. But because we have done that, then that figure is, I think, around just under 2 FTEs. And the contracts will vary. What we've tried to do, in terms of libraries and the way that we've staffed them in the past, there's been lots of very small contracts, 2 or 3 hours a week. It's been very difficult to sort of replicate that. So what we've tried to do is either make the contracts bigger and more attractive to people, by making them, over 10 or 15 hours a week, half-time, very few full-time at this level. And we've tried to do that. So it is very difficult to actually say, on average, what the difference would be. Somebody might be working a 6-hour contract a week. We always try to make sure that people don't gain necessarily, but we always try and get the best fit in terms of what their nearest hours are.
Right, thank you for that, Nigel. Certainly we note the report, and again, everything is going in the right direction. We will now adjourn for lunch. Could I ask everybody to be back in the room promptly for a 2 o'clock start for this afternoon session? Thank you.